This is part 2 of U.S. history, starting on page 299. At the top, it's chapter 9, section 2, the Vietnam War in the Cold War era. Section overview. The fear of communist expansion led the United States to become increasingly involved in the Southeast Asia. This involvement led to the Vietnam War. As the war dragged on, American support began to erode. The combination of negative public opinion and the inability of the military to achieve clear-cut victory led to a gradual withdrawal from the war. Meanwhile, great social and cultural changes were taking place in many parts of the American society. All right, some unifying themes. We have time, continuity, and change. Those are things we can look for. The Cold War continues. The United States emerged from World War II as the strongest nation in the world. It controlled the atomic bomb, and its economy was undamaged by the destruction of the war. The Soviet Union, however, quickly became America's chief rival. By 1949, it too had the atomic bomb. It had also taken control of most of the nations of Eastern Europe and was seeking to extend its influence elsewhere. As you read in the previous section, President Harry S. Truman began the policy of containment after the war in an attempt to limit the spread of communism. As the United States and the Soviet Union, the two world superpowers, attempted to maintain a balance of the power, a Cold War developed. Eisenhower's foreign policy. As president, Dwight D. Eisenhower continued Trump's basic policy of containment. However, he and his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, introduced some new ideas. Eisenhower worried that defense spending would bankrupt the nation, yet he feared that the Soviets might see cutbacks in military spending as a sign of weakness. Eisenhower and Dulles instead devised a new look for the nation's defense. The United States would rely more heavily on air power and nuclear weapons than on ground troops. Dulles announced a policy of massive retaliation. This meant that the United States would consider the use of a nuclear weapon to halt aggression if it believed the nation's interests were threatened. Dulles further stated that the nation must be ready to go to the brink of war in order to preserve world peace. This policy of brinkmanship greatly increased the world's tensions during the 1950s. Foreign policy in Asia. Asia became a major area of concern for the United States foreign policy. The communist victory in China in 1949 raised fears of further communist expansion. The war in Korea, even though it ended in what was basically a draw in 1953, added to these fears. The domino theory. As communists took control of the governments of China and later some nations of Southeast Asia, American worries about communist expansion increased. Eisenhower stated that the United States must resist further aggression in the region and explained what came to be known as the domino theory. The nations of Asia, he said, were like a row of dominoes standing on end. If one fell to communism, the rest would sure to follow. Sato. One way to resist aggression, Dulles claimed, was through alliances. To mirror the formation of NATO in Europe, Dulles in 1954 pushed the creation of the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, or SATO. Its original members, Pakistan, Thailand, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, Great Britain, and the United States, pledged to meet any common danger from communist aggression. Fear of communist expansion led the United States to become deeply involved in Southeast Asia. Review the chart on the next page to learn about the growing involvement of the United States in the region. Before we review the chart on page 301, let's look at the chart above on 300. We can look at the dates. The name of the chart, the title of the chart is The Cold War 1950 through 1960. You can see 1950 says the Korean War began. It began then. Then 1952 Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president. You look at 1953, the Korean War ends. You go further down to the right. 1955, the Summit Conference in Geneva. 1956, the Suez Crisis begins, the Hungarian Revolt. Then you have 1959, Castro wins power in Cuba. Then you have 1960, U-2 shot down over USSR. Now if we go over to page 301, the other chart, unrest in Asia, 1945 through 1960. The first date is 1945. World War II ended in Asia. Ho Chi Minh, a member of the Communist Party since 1920, proclaimed the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. Then you have 1946 through 1949. You have France, which had controlled Vietnam since the 19th century, appointed a puppet leader named Bao Day, who was ineffective against the power of Ho Chi Minh. In 1949, Mao Zedong declared the Communist People's Republic of China, recognized the Vietnamese government of Ho Chi Minh in 1950. Between 1950 and 1953, the United States fought in the Korean War and provided the French with financial aid in their struggle to hang on to Vietnam. In 1953 to 1954, President Eisenhower debated how far the United States should go in backing the French. In 1954, the forces of Ho Chi Minh defeated the French in Dong Peng Po. Geneva Accords divided the Vietnam in the 17th parallel. North and South Vietnam agreed to hold elections in 1953 to reunite the country. The United States joined with 7 Asian and European nations in Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SATO, an anti-communist pact which extended protection to Vietnam. In 1953, the United States under President Eisenhower increased aid in South Vietnam. In 1956, South Vietnamese President Dinh Dang, forgive me again, fearing the popularity of Ho Chi Minh, refused to hold elections scheduled under the Geneva Accords. And in 1960, Ho Chi Minh recognized the Viet Cong. It was a communist guerrillas in South Vietnam as the National Liberation Front, NLF, of Vietnam. President Kennedy at this time sent Vice President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, to study the crisis in Vietnam. This is really before the United States involvement, physical troops involvement. So now we have Kennedy and growing involvement in Vietnam. President John F. Kennedy shared Eisenhower's belief in the domino theory. He therefore continued to support the Diem regime. By 1963, the number of United States advisors in South Vietnam totaled about 17,000. That year, 489 Americans died in fighting in Vietnam. American advisors urged Diem to adopt reforms to broaden his support. Diem, however, brutally suppressed all opponents and ruled as a direct dictator. On November 2nd, 1963, the South Vietnamese military overthrew Diem and the knowledge and approval of the United States. Around the same time, the White House announced that it intended to withdraw United States military personnel from Vietnam by 1965. Kennedy was unable to keep this promise because he was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. Johnson and the escalation of war in Vietnam. Under the Constitution, only Congress can declare war. However, by 1964, 3 presidents, we have Eisenhower, Kennedy, and now Lyndon B. Johnson, had sent United States aid and troops to Vietnam. Each did so by acting as the commander-in-chief of the nation's military. Commander-in-chief is also the President of the United States. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. On August 4th, 1964, President Johnson escalated the war dramatically. He announced on television that American destroyers had been the victim of an unprovoked attack by North Vietnamese gunboats. It later appeared that the ships might have been protecting the South Vietnamese boats headed into North Vietnamese waters. The next day, Johnson asked Congress for the authority to order airstrikes against North Vietnam. With only 2 dissenting votes, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. The resolution empowered the president as commander-in-chief to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States and to prevent further aggression. Johnson used the resolution to justify expansion of the war. By April 1965, U.S. planes regularly bombed North Vietnam, a guerrilla war. At first, the United States military leaders expected the nation's superior technology would guarantee victory. However, they soon found themselves bogged down in a guerrilla war. It was fought in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The enemy did not wear uniforms, and no clear battlefront emerged. Thousands of Vietnamese casualties occurred each month as the United States dropped more bombs on Vietnam, an area about twice the size of New York State, than it had used on Nazi Germany during the heaviest month of fighting during World War II. If you want to look at the map down there in Vietnam 1968, Vietnam is more or less the southeast portion of the map. All right, you have North Korea, South Korea. South Korea, that's where we, the United States, were trying to keep North Korea from spreading their communism down to South Korea. All right, reasons for war. The massive commitment in Vietnam raised questions in the minds of many Americans about why the United States got involved in the Vietnam and why it stayed there. The administration argued that the United States was involved in Vietnam to prevent the fall of Vietnam to communism, to stop the rise of aggressor governments, and to protect the nation's position as a superpower and defender of the democracy. However, as the war dragged on, many Americans began to question these motives. Resistance to the war. By late 1965, an anti-war movement had begun to take shape in the United States. Hawks and doves. In Congress, there were differences of opinion concerning the war. Some stood solidly behind the president and argued in favor of victory at any cost. These members were known as hawks. Think hawks. Hawks are more aggressive. They're a bird of prey, aggression. They supported the war. Those who favored immediate withdrawal and an end of war were known as doves. Doves, they're white, peaceful birds. Thinks peace. Hawks were for war. Doves did not want war. Student protests. College campuses became centers of political protest against the war. The University of California, Berkeley campus became a leader in the anti-Vietnam War protests. The name Berkeley became synonymous with the activities of the protest movement. Students organized a new form of protest called teach-ins, in meetings in which speakers, usually promoting unconditional American withdrawal from Vietnam, held study sessions and rallies. The strongest anti-war group in the 1960s was Students for Democratic Society, the SDS, founded in 1960. SDS was anti-establishment or against big business and government. It led to demonstrations, sit-ins, draft card burnings, and protests against universities with pro-establishment regulations. By 1969, the organization had collapsed into a number of splinter groups. However, the SDS's legal legacy of protests against authority remained strong forces through the 1970s. Protest marches. People of all ages joined in protest marches against the war. The first huge march took place in Washington, D.C. in 1965. In 1967, some 300,000 Americans marched in New York City. That same year, another 50,000 tried to shut down